Welcome to today's Explainer. We're going to dive right in and demystify the invisible operating systems of our world. I'm talking about the fascinating and honestly pretty messy reality of global legal frameworks. Now, when we think of the law, most of us naturally picture this single unified set of rules, right? We imagine laws handed down by a centralized government, housed in big marble buildings, and applied exactly the same way to everyone within a country's borders. But what if I told you that for literally billions of people, that unified system is a complete myth? Today, we're unpacking the rich, incredibly complex tapestry of global legal pluralism. We'll draw on some deep historical analysis and comparative law to see how communities actually govern themselves on the ground.
Okay, check out this staggering statistic from the World Bank. In parts of Africa, up to 90% of the population is governed by customary systems that operate entirely outside of formal state control. Just think about that for a second. 90%. We're talking about the vast majority of land transactions in countries like Mozambique and Ghana being handled not by state judges banging gavels, but through local customs. In Sierra Leone, about 85% of the population falls under the jurisdiction of unwritten, traditional rules. This completely flips our standard Western assumption about how order is actually maintained in modern societies.
So, that brings us to Section 1, the comparative law landscape. We are going to completely shatter the assumption that law is just a single, uniform set of rules written down by some government.
To really understand the globe, we've got to look through the lens of comparative law. Basically, this is a discipline that asks how different legal cultures try to solve human issues based on their specific environments and histories. And the absolutely crucial point here is understanding this concept called legal pluralism. Essentially, it's a reality where modern state courts constantly overlap with deeply rooted indigenous and religious traditions. Imagine living in a society where, depending on whether you're buying property, getting married, or maybe settling a business dispute, you might bounce between a formal state court, a religious tribunal, or even a gathering of village elders. Legal pluralism isn't just some glitch in the system or a temporary phase a developing country goes through. It is the permanent, enduring socio-legal arrangement for billions of people.
Moving on to Section 2, common law versus civil law. Let's establish our Western baseline here.
When European powers eventually spread across the globe, they brought their own specific legal traditions along with them. And those traditions were fundamentally split into two distinct camps. You've got the highly flexible, precedent-based common law. Think of it like organic growing branches, pitted directly against the rigid, statute-driven columns of civil law. On one side, the common law system, which started in England, absolutely thrives on analogy and the lived, everyday experience of judges. It's flexible, it evolves case by case, and it's actually a major reason why London's financial center operates the way it does today. On the flip side, civil law works with maximum abstraction. You have professional jurists creating highly organized, systematic codes, and then judges simply apply those generalized rules to specific cases. These are essentially the two massive legal exports of the West.
Which brings us to Section 3, global legal traditions beyond the West. Let's expand our lens a bit.
Because, if we only look at common and civil law, we're missing out on some incredibly diverse approaches to governance that shape massive, massive populations. Take a look at the secular single-party system driving China's industrial gears on one side, and the deeply rooted Sharia traditions reflected in the Islamic world on the other. It becomes super clear that law is a cultural inflection, not just some universal principle. In the People's Republic of China, their system prioritizes lightning-speed economic growth over multi-party liberal democratic norms. Then, on the other hand, Islamic law, or Sharia, is this religion-based tradition highly influential in nations like Pakistan, Iran, and Iraq. It particularly dominates things like family and civil matters, and its norms even show up in immigrant communities within secular Western nations. So law here isn't just a list of rules to follow. It's literally an extension of core cultural and religious identity.
This leads perfectly into Section 4, the colonial roots of pluralism. Let's look at how this all started.
So how did all these incredibly different global traditions end up getting violently and organically stitched together into the pluralism we see today? Well, if we trace the colonial collision, for the first few hundred years, from about 1500 to 1800, European expansion was mostly just coastal trade outposts. But man, everything changed in the late 19th century. Culminating in the 1884 Berlin Conference, European empires literally just carved up the African continent on a map, and they did this with zero indigenous input. Zero. They drew borders that smashed completely different ethnic, cultural, and religious groups together into single territories, while violently splitting others apart. And when these nations finally gained independence in the mid-20th century, they inherited these profoundly fragmented, pluralistic legal systems that had just been cobbled together by colonial powers.
Now, to manage these massive new territories on the cheap, European empires largely ruled through what they called indirect rule. And honestly, it was a highly expedient system for them. Instead of replacing local leaders, a British governor, for example, would assess the taxes and then rely on traditional local chiefs to actually collect those taxes and extract labor for European plantations. To back up the chief's authority, the colonial state created these native courts. But here's the catch: they weren't purely traditional at all. They were hybrid systems, funded by the state, enforcing a totally transformed version of custom that specifically served colonial interests. They basically just bolted a Western administrative apparatus right onto traditional hierarchies. Just listen to this quote from 1922 by colonial administrator Frederick Lugard. It perfectly captures the sheer arrogance of the imperial mindset at the time. He openly argued that Europe benefited economically from African resources, while Africa supposedly benefited by receiving European manufactured goods and, this is his exact phrase, the substitution of law and order for the methods of barbarism. This explicitly shows how colonial legal systems were fundamentally designed to justify and enforce political and economic domination, all dressed up under the guise of civilizing the local populations.
But in stark contrast to that rigid, top-down imperial mindset, the famous jurist Oliver Wendell Holmes reminds us of something crucial. He famously said that the true heart of any functioning legal system is actually lived human experience. While colonial powers tried their hardest to impose their rigid logic onto colonized lands, they completely ignored the fact that true law grows organically from a community's daily life, its culture, and its relationships. You really cannot just drop a foreign logical grid onto a society and expect it to magically overwrite centuries of lived social experience. It just doesn't work that way.
Which takes us to Section 5, the customary law reality. This is where things get really fascinating.
Because that lived experience has survived and evolved, bring us to the reality of customary law across the global South today. Despite decades of colonial rule and then subsequent efforts by newly independent states to try and unify their legal codes, local traditions didn't just disappear. Far from it. Instead of a single path, the lived reality for millions of people is this incredibly colorful, overlapping tapestry where formal state laws, religious mandates, and deep-seated local customs interact every single day. In one single community, state officials might actually defer to a village tribunal on a land dispute, or a traditional chief might sit on a state-sponsored local council. The lines are totally blurred, intertwined, and constantly being negotiated. People naturally do what's called form shop, navigating between state and non-state systems depending on what is most accessible, what's affordable, and what's culturally familiar to them.
In these highly resilient village tribunals, for instance, you're rarely going to find a judge swinging a gavel to declare a strict winner and loser based on some written code. Instead, you have respected community elders whose main goal is to restore peace and relationships. I mean, think about it. When you live in a small, tight-knit village, applying a rigid rule that alienates half the community, it just isn't practical. These tribunals look at the entire history of the relationship between the people arguing. They prioritize dialogue, open debate, and reaching an equitable compromise. And a lot of times, it ends in a traditional feast or a formal apology. It just goes to show that, on the ground, justice is very often about social harmony rather than just winning a case.
And that brings us to our final section, Section 6, Measuring Law, Numbers versus Culture.
Today, we face a massive tension, a real modern struggle unfolding in the world of comparative law right now. On one side, you've got these huge international organizations, like the World Bank with their incredibly influential doing business metrics. They actively try to quantify and standardize laws across countries into easily digestible numbers, essentially arguing that adopting standardized, often Western-style laws is the absolute best way to attract investment and drive economic growth. But on the other side, you have traditional comparative law. This camp argues that law is an interpretive, highly cultural activity. Their point is, you can't just copy-paste a law from a desk in London to a village in Tanzania and expect it to work, especially if it completely ignores the organic, lived reality of how that specific community actually governs itself.
So I'm going to leave you with this final, provocative thought to take away. As our world becomes more and more interconnected, will our deeply diverse legal systems ultimately be completely flattened into standardized economic statistics just for the sake of global business? Or is there an essential, profoundly human value in our legal diversity, in those village tribunals, in local customs, and in unique cultural traditions that numbers simply cannot capture? The way we end up answering that question is going to define the future of global justice. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember, keep questioning the systems around you.